The icy wind bit through my thin coat as I stood on the cracked sidewalk outside my son's house in Chicago, clutching a faded photograph of us from better days. 15 cars lined the street like an unwelcoming army, and nailed to the porch was a sign that stabbed deeper than any cold, family members only. That night, as Christmas lights flickered behind curtained windows, I was not family. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, though everyone used to call me Maggie. I'm 73 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've lived alone in a small apartment in Pilsen, one of Chicago's most vibrant neighborhoods. The walls are thin, and I can hear my neighbors speaking Spanish through the plaster, their voices mixing with the distant rumble of the Blue Line train that rattles the windows every 20 minutes. It's become the soundtrack of my solitude. My days had grown wearisome and gray, shadowed by the noise of the city but robbed of its warmth. Each morning, I'd wake to the smell of fresh tortillas from the bakery downstairs, but my own kitchen remained cold and unused except for the single cup of coffee I'd brew while standing at the window, watching the world move without me. The apartment felt too big and too small at the same time. Too big for one person, too small for all the memories I'd crammed into its corners. I kept a stack of greeting cards on my kitchen table, birthday cards, Christmas cards, Mother's Day cards, all addressed and sealed but never sent. What was the point? My phone hadn't rung in months, not unless it was a telemarketer or my doctor's office confirming an appointment. The silence had become so familiar that when the refrigerator hummed to life, I'd jump, startled by any sound that wasn't my own breathing. But that December evening, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the way the Christmas lights twinkled in every window except my own, or maybe it was the weight of another holiday approaching with no invitations, no plans, no acknowledgement that I even existed. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, studying the woman staring back at me. When had I become so invisible? When had my own son decided I was no longer worth a phone call, a visit, or even a text message? I remember pulling out that old photograph, the one where Michael was 8 years old, his gap-toothed smile wide as he hugged my waist on Christmas morning. I was younger then, my hair still brown instead of the silver gray that I've learned to accept. We looked so happy. We were happy. Or at least, I thought we were. That's when I made the decision. I would surprise him. It had been over a year since I'd seen my son, longer since I'd seen my grandchildren. I imagined walking up those familiar steps to his house in Lincoln Park, the warmth of his smile when he opened the door, the children running to hug their grandmother. I imagined the smell of turkey and stuffing, the sound of laughter echoing through rooms I'd helped him furnish with my savings account. I put on my best coat, the navy blue one I'd bought for his wedding 7 years ago, and wrapped the presents I'd been keeping under my bed since last Christmas. 3 gifts for my grandchildren, carefully chosen and lovingly wrapped in paper that had cost me more than I usually spend on groceries in a week. I took the bus across town, my heart hammering with anticipation and nervous energy. But as I stepped off at his stop, something felt wrong. The street was packed with cars I didn't recognize. Luxury vehicles with gleaming paint and expensive rims, parked bumper to bumper along both sides of the narrow residential street. I counted 15 cars as I walked toward Michael's house, my steps slowing with each one I passed. And then I saw it. Nailed to the porch railing, written in bold black letters on white poster board, family members only. Below it, in smaller print, please respect our privacy during this celebration. I stood there for a long time, reading those words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Family members only. But I was family. I was his mother. I was the one who'd rocked him through fevers, who'd stayed up all night helping with school projects, who'd worked double shifts to pay for his college tuition when his father left us with nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. The windows glowed with warm yellow light, and I could hear voices inside, laughter and conversation floating out into the cold December air. Children's voices. My grandchildren's voices. They were so close I could almost touch them, but that sign might as well have been a brick wall. I walked up to the porch anyway. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he'd forgotten to mention it was a surprise party and I was actually invited. Maybe there was some explanation that would make this all make sense. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles could touch the wood, the door opened. It wasn't Michael who answered. It was his wife, Sandra. Her face went through a series of expressions in the space of a heartbeat. Surprise, annoyance, and then something that looked almost like panic. "Margaret," she said, her voice tight. "What are you doing here?" "I came to surprise Michael for Christmas," I said, holding up the bag of presents. "I brought gifts for the children." She glanced back into the house, then stepped outside and pulled the door almost closed behind her. "This isn't a good time. We're having a private family gathering." "But I am family," I whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across her face that might have been guilt. It's complicated, Margaret. Maybe you could come another time? Call first next time. Call first. When had I become someone who needed permission to visit my own son? I heard Michael's voice from inside, calling out, "Who is it, honey?" Sandra turned her head toward the sound but didn't answer. When she looked back at me, her expression had hardened. "I really think it's best if you go home. We'll call you tomorrow." But even as she said it, we both knew it was a lie. Tomorrow would come and go just like all the other tomorrows, silent and empty. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice not to crack. I turned and walked back down those same porch steps I'd climbed with such hope just minutes before. As I walked away, I could hear the door close behind me, and then the sound of laughter resumed from inside the house. I made it to the corner before the tears started. Not the gentle, quiet tears of sadness, but the harsh, choking sobs of someone whose heart is breaking in real time. I sat down on the bus stop bench, not caring who might see me, not caring about the cold seeping through my coat. The presents sat on the bench beside me, their cheerful wrapping paper now seeming to mock my foolishness. How had I become this person? How had I become someone my own son was ashamed to acknowledge? The questions swirled in my head as I rode the bus back to Pilsen, staring out the window at the city lights blurring past through my tears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen chair, still wearing my coat, staring at the wall where I'd hung a calendar with pictures of puppies that someone had given me last Christmas. December 21st was circled in red pen. I'd marked it weeks ago as the day I would visit Michael, full of hope and excitement about surprising my family. Instead, I'd learned that I wasn't family at all. I was just an obligation they preferred to avoid. Years of memories came flooding back as I sat there in the dark. I remembered the sacrifices I'd made, the prices I'd paid, the love I'd given freely and without reservation. Michael had been my whole world after his father left. I'd worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, cleaning offices at dawn, working retail during the day, and waitressing at night. My hands never stopped moving, my feet never stopped aching, but I told myself it was all worth it because I was building a life for my son. When he was 16 and got arrested for shoplifting, I didn't lecture him. I held him while he cried and promised him we'd get through it together. When he was 19 and dropped out of college for the first semester, I didn't get angry. I worked extra shifts and saved every penny so he could go back. When he was 25 and lost his first real job because he couldn't get along with his supervisor, I lent him money to cover his rent while he looked for something new. I was always there. Always ready with a solution, a loan, a shoulder to cry on, or a meal when he was too proud to admit he was struggling. When he met Sandra, I welcomed her like the daughter I'd never had. When they bought their first house, I emptied my modest investment account to help with the down payment. When the grandchildren came, I was the built-in babysitter, the emergency contact, the grandmother who showed up with homemade cookies and boundless patience. But somewhere along the way, my son stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as a service provider. Someone who could be called upon when needed and ignored when convenient. The phone calls became shorter, more focused on what he needed rather than how I was doing. The visits became less frequent, and when they did happen, they felt rushed and obligatory. I started to notice the little things. How Sandra would check her phone while I was talking. How the children would barely look up from their tablets when I came over. How Michael would glance at his watch and mention having other plans when I'd only been there for an hour. The signs were all there, but I'd chosen to ignore them because the alternative was too painful to consider. My son was pulling away from me, and I didn't know why. I thought about the times I'd offered advice and been told I was interfering. The times I'd tried to help with the children and been told they had it handled. The times I'd asked about family events and been told they were keeping things small. Always small. Always without me. The money was another issue that I tried not to think about too carefully. Over the years, I'd lent Michael thousands of dollars. For the house down payment, for a new car when his broke down, for unexpected medical bills, for home repairs, for the children's private school tuition. Each time, he promised to pay me back when things got better. Each time, I told him not to worry about it because that's what mothers do for their children. But things never got better, and the promises were never kept. Meanwhile, my own savings dwindled. I postponed my own medical appointments because the co-pays were getting harder to afford. I shopped at discount grocery stores and clipped coupons like my mother had during the Depression. I kept the heat turned down in my apartment and wore sweaters indoors to save on the gas bill. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that Michael would remember all I'd done for him and find a way to help me when I needed it most. I told myself that blood was thicker than water and family took care of family. But as I sat in that dark kitchen on the night I'd been turned away from his door, I finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding for years. I wasn't being treated like family. I was being treated like a bank account with legs. An ATM that dispensed love and money on demand but could be ignored when it was empty or inconvenient. The realization hit me like a physical blow. All those years of sacrifice, all those sleepless nights working extra shifts, all those times I'd gone without so he could have what he needed, and this was what I had to show for it? A son who couldn't even acknowledge my existence at a family gathering? I thought about my own mother, who died 10 years earlier. She'd lived with me during her final years, and toward the end, she'd grown bitter and suspicious, convinced that people were only kind to her because they wanted something. I dismissed her concerns as paranoia, the product of a failing mind. Now I wondered if she'd simply learned the lesson I was learning now, that love without boundaries becomes exploitation, and kindness without limits becomes weakness. The next morning brought no relief from the pain, but it did bring clarity. I made myself coffee and toast and sat down to really think about my situation for the first time in years. I pulled out a notebook and started writing down everything I could remember about my relationship with Michael over the past 5 years. The pattern was undeniable once I saw it written in black and white. Every phone call was a request for something. Money, babysitting, help with some crisis or another. Every visit was brief and focused on his agenda, not mine. Every holiday was spent apart, always with some excuse about why I wasn't included in their plans. I thought about my health scare the previous spring, when I'd collapsed at the grocery store and been rushed to the hospital with what the doctors initially thought might be a heart attack. It turned out to be a panic attack brought on by stress and exhaustion, but I'd been terrified in those first hours when I didn't know what was happening to me. I'd called Michael from the hospital bed, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. When he answered, I could hear voices in the background, laughter and conversation that suggested he was at some social gathering. "Mom? What's up?" His tone was casual, distracted. "I'm in the hospital," I'd said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I collapsed at the store. They're running tests." There was a pause, and then he said, "Oh wow. That's scary. Are you okay? Do you need me to come down there?" But even as he asked, I could hear the reluctance in his voice. The hope that I would say no, that I wouldn't need him to interrupt his evening for something as inconvenient as his mother's medical emergency. "No," I'd said, because I couldn't bear to be a burden. "I'm sure it's nothing. The doctor will be in soon." "Okay, good. Well, keep me posted, alright? I'm at Dave's barbecue, but call me if you need anything." He'd hung up before I could respond, and I'd spent the rest of the night alone in that hospital bed, listening to machines beep and watching nurses check on patients who had family members sitting beside them, holding their hands and stroking their foreheads. Michael never called back to check on me. When I got home the next day, exhausted and emotionally drained, my phone was silent. It took 3 days before he remembered to ask how I was feeling, and when I told him about the diagnosis and the recommended changes to my lifestyle, he'd listen with half his attention, making appropriate sounds at the right moments but clearly thinking about something else. That's when Mrs. Torres from downstairs had knocked on my door, her arms full of homemade soup and warm tortillas. She'd heard from another neighbor about my trip to the hospital, and she wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself. "You shouldn't be alone right now," she'd said in her gentle voice, her accent softening the vowels in a way that reminded me of my childhood in a neighborhood that used to be full of immigrants from Ireland and Poland. Now it was full of immigrants from Mexico and Central America, but the spirit of community remained the same in pockets, in people like Mrs. Torres who remembered that neighbors were supposed to look out for each other. She'd sat with me while I ate the soup, asking about my family and listening as I explained that my son was very busy with his own life, too busy to fuss over his mother's health problems. "Children forget sometimes," she'd said diplomatically. "They get caught up in their own troubles and don't see what's right in front of them." But I could see in her eyes that she knew better. This wasn't about forgetting. This was about priorities, and I wasn't high enough on my son's list to merit real concern. As the months passed after my hospital scare, I started to pay closer attention to the way Michael interacted with me. The conversations became even more perfunctory, more focused on what he needed rather than how I was doing. The requests for financial help became more frequent and more urgent. "Mom, I hate to ask, but we're a little short on the mortgage payment this month. Sandra's been out sick, and we lost some income. Could you help us out just this once?" Just this once. I'd heard that phrase so many times it had lost all meaning. But I always said yes because what if this really was the time they needed me most? What if saying no meant they'd lose their house, and it would be my fault? So I'd transfer money from my already thin savings account, money I'd been setting aside for my own emergencies, and I'd tell myself that this was what family did for each other. I'd remind myself of all the times my mother had sacrificed for me, all the ways love was supposed to be selfless and giving. But love without reciprocation isn't love at all. It's something else entirely. Something that leaves you empty and hollow and questioning your own worth. The breaking point came in October, just 2 months before that disastrous Christmas Eve visit. Michael had called with another financial emergency, something about the children needing new clothes and school supplies and Sandra's car needing repairs. "I know I still owe you from last time," he'd said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of practiced helplessness. But I promise I'll pay it all back as soon as my next commission check comes through. You know I'm good for it, Mom. And for the first time in years, I'd hesitated. I'd looked around my apartment at the bills stacked on my kitchen counter, at the notices from my credit card company, at the reminder from my doctor's office about my overdue balance. I'd calculated how much money I had left in my checking account and realized that if I helped him again, I wouldn't be able to afford my prescription medications for the rest of the month. Michael, I'd said carefully, I'm having some money troubles of my own right now. Maybe you could ask Sandra's parents for help this time? The silence that followed was so long I thought the call had been dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. I can't believe you're saying no to me right now. After everything I've been through. After everything our family is dealing with. I thought I could count on you, Mom, but I guess I was wrong. And then he'd hung up on me. Just like that. No goodbye, no acknowledgement that I might have my own struggles, no recognition that asking for help from other sources might actually be a reasonable suggestion. Just cold anger and a dial tone. That was in October. It was now December, and I hadn't heard from him since. No return call to apologize or check on me. No text message to see how I was managing my finances or my health. Nothing. The silence had been deafening, but I'd convinced myself that he just needed time to cool down. That he'd call before the holidays and we'd work things out. That's why I decided to surprise him on Christmas Eve, to show up with gifts and love and proof that I was still his mother, still someone who cared about his happiness even when he hurt me. Instead, I'd found that sign on his door and learned that my place in his life was even smaller than I'd imagined. But sitting in my kitchen that night, reviewing all of this history, I felt something shift inside me that I hadn't expected. Alongside the pain and humiliation, there was also anger. Real, honest anger at being treated so poorly by someone I'd loved so completely. I thought about all the birthdays and holidays Michael had celebrated without including me. I thought about all the family photos posted on social media that I saw by accident when other neighbors shared them, photos of gatherings I'd never been invited to, celebrations that went on without my knowledge or participation. I thought about the grandchildren I barely knew, who were being raised to see me as a peripheral figure in their lives rather than the grandmother who loved them desperately from a distance. I thought about all the bedtime stories I'd never been asked to read, all the school plays I'd never been invited to attend, all the milestones I'd only heard about secondhand if I heard about them at all. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just sad or hurt, but genuinely angry at the waste of it all. The waste of love that had been given but not returned. The waste of time spent hoping for phone calls that never came. The waste of money that had been given freely but never acknowledged or repaid. I was angry at Michael for taking advantage of my love and my financial resources without offering anything meaningful in return. I was angry at Sandra for treating me like an inconvenience rather than a family member. I was angry at myself for allowing it to happen for so long, for making excuses and justifications when the truth was sitting right in front of me. But most of all, I was angry at the years I'd lost. The years I could have spent building relationships with people who actually valued my company, pursuing interests that brought me joy, creating a life that was about more than just waiting for crumbs of affection from people who clearly didn't respect or appreciate me. I was 73 years old, and I'd spent the last decade of my life being treated like a convenience store that was open 24 hours but never properly maintained or appreciated. Well, this convenience store was about to close. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before in my entire relationship with my son. When he called, I let it go to voicemail. He'd probably called to offer some perfunctory explanation about the previous evening, maybe to suggest we get together for a quick coffee sometime in the new year when things settled down. The old me would have answered on the first ring, desperate to hear his voice and willing to accept whatever minimal effort he was prepared to offer. But I wasn't the old me anymore. Something fundamental had changed when I stood on that porch and realized that my own son was ashamed to acknowledge my existence. Something had broken, but something else had been born. I played his voicemail message after he hung up. His voice sounded casual, almost cheerful, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Hey Mom, sorry about last night. That was kind of awkward, huh? Listen, maybe we can grab lunch next week or something. I'll call you in a few days and we'll figure something out. Hope you're doing okay. Talk soon. Talk soon. Figure something out. Maybe we can grab lunch." The language of someone who was managing a minor inconvenience, not someone who was talking to his mother who he'd publicly humiliated and rejected. I didn't call him back. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to smooth things over or make excuses for his behavior or pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Instead, I spent the day thinking about what I wanted my life to look like. Not what I wanted from Michael or what I hoped he might eventually become, but what I wanted for myself. What would make me happy? What would give me purpose? What would help me feel valued and respected? The answers surprised me. I wanted to take an art class. I wanted to travel to places I'd never seen. I wanted to volunteer for causes I cared about. I wanted to make friends who actually enjoyed my company and looked forward to spending time with me. I wanted to live in a space that reflected my interests and taste rather than being a museum of memories from people who'd moved on without me. Most importantly, I wanted to stop waiting. I'd spent so many years waiting for Michael to become the son I needed him to be, waiting for phone calls and visits and acknowledgement that never came. I'd put my own life on hold while I waited for scraps of attention from someone who clearly had better things to do with his time. No more waiting. I was going to start living. The first concrete step came that afternoon when I walked down to Mrs. Torres' apartment and knocked on her door. She welcomed me with her usual warmth, offering coffee and asking about my Christmas. I told her everything. About the sign on the door, about Sandra's dismissal, about the years of financial exploitation and emotional neglect. I told her about the anger I was finally letting myself feel and the decisions I was starting to make about my future. She listened without judgment, nodding at the right moments and making sympathetic sounds when I described the most painful parts. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "My daughter lives in California," she said finally. "She calls me every Sunday, and every Sunday she asks when I'm going to move out there to be closer to her and the grandchildren. You know what I tell her?" I shook my head. "I tell her I have a life here. I have friends and routines and places I like to go. I tell her that if she wants to see me more often, she can visit me here, or we can meet somewhere fun for a vacation together. But I'm not going to rearrange my entire existence around someone else's idea of what my life should look like, even if that someone is my daughter." She leaned forward and took my hand. "You've been rearranging your life around your son's needs for so long that you forgot you have needs too. You forgot that you deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. You forgot that love is supposed to go both ways." That's when I started crying again, but these were different tears. Not the desperate, helpless tears I'd shed the night before, but the tears that come when someone finally sees you clearly and reflects back your worth. "What should I do?" I asked her. "You should do whatever makes you happy," she said simply. "Stop asking what Michael needs or what Michael wants. Start asking what Margaret needs and what Margaret wants. The answer might surprise you." That evening, I made a list. Not a list of grievances or complaints, but a list of things I wanted to do with my life. Things I'd put off or dismissed as impractical or selfish. Things that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or grandmother or former wife, but everything to do with being myself. I wanted to learn to paint. I'd always been drawn to art but had never had the time or money to pursue it seriously. There was a community center in Pilsen that offered classes for seniors at reduced rates. I wanted to travel. I'd never been to New York to visit my sister properly, never taken a vacation that wasn't centered around visiting family or attending someone else's event. I had some savings left, not much after all the loans to Michael, but enough for a modest trip if I planned carefully. I wanted to volunteer somewhere that mattered. I'd spent my career taking care of other people in various service jobs, and I discovered I was good at it and enjoyed it when the people I was helping actually appreciated what I was doing. Most importantly, I wanted to set boundaries. I wanted to stop being available for every crisis and request that came my way. I wanted people to understand that my time and money and emotional energy were valuable resources that needed to be respected. The next week, I took action on all of these desires. I enrolled in a beginner's painting class that met on Tuesday evenings. I made an appointment with a travel agent to discuss options for visiting my sister in New York. I filled out volunteer applications at 3 different organizations that served seniors and families in need. And when Michael called again, I let it go to voicemail again. This time, his message sounded slightly more concerned. "Mom, I'm starting to worry about you. You haven't called me back, and that's not like you. Are you okay? Are you mad at me about something? Call me when you get this." I almost called him back. The old habits were strong, and hearing that note of worry in his voice triggered all my maternal instincts. But then I remembered standing on his porch, reading that sign, feeling the sharp edge of rejection cutting through all my hopes and expectations. If he was worried about me, he knew where I lived. He could get in his car and drive to Pilsen and knock on my door and have an actual conversation about what had happened and why. The fact that he was handling his concern through increasingly frequent voicemail messages told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. I didn't call him back, but I did start my painting class. The instructor was a woman named Elena who'd immigrated from Guatemala 20 years earlier and now taught art to supplement her income as a school custodian. She had gentle hands and infinite patience, guiding us through basic techniques while encouraging us to find our own artistic voices. The first time I held a brush loaded with paint and made a mark on canvas, something inside me unclenched that had been tight for years. The paint didn't care about my mistakes or my age or my complicated family situation. It just responded to the pressure and movement of the brush, creating something that hadn't existed before. I wasn't good at it initially. My hands shook slightly from arthritis, and my color choices were timid and uncertain. But Elena reminded us that art wasn't about being good or bad, it was about expressing something true about our experience of being alive. Paint your feelings, she told us during the second week. Don't paint what you think you should paint or what you think looks pretty. Paint what's real for you right now. So I painted loneliness. Dark blues and grays swirling together with small patches of yellow that might have been hope or might have been memory. It wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense, but it was mine, and it was honest. The other students in the class were mostly women around my age, dealing with their own versions of loss and transition. Maria had been recently widowed after 45 years of marriage. Susan was recovering from breast cancer and learning to see herself as more than her illness. Dorothy was caring for her husband who had dementia and needed a few hours each week to remember who she was outside of being his caregiver. We started going out for coffee after class, sharing stories and laughing about our terrible early paintings. It was the first time in years that I'd been part of a group where I felt genuinely welcomed and valued, where my opinions were solicited and my experiences were treated as interesting rather than burdensome. Meanwhile, Michael's voicemails became more frequent and more frustrated. Mom, I don't know what's going on with you, but you're starting to worry Sandra and the kids. This silent treatment isn't like you. Please call me back so we can talk about whatever's bothering you. Silent treatment. As if my failure to respond immediately to his calls was some kind of punishment I was inflicting rather than a natural consequence of his behavior toward me. As if I owed him my constant availability regardless of how he chose to treat me. I was learning new words in my painting class, words that described concepts I'd never had language for before. Boundaries. Self-care. Reciprocity. Elena used these terms casually as she talked about her own life and relationships, and I found myself mentally filing them away for later consideration. Boundaries were particularly interesting to me. Elena explained that healthy relationships required clear boundaries, places where one person's needs and responsibilities ended and another person's began. She'd learned this lesson the hard way when her own extended family had expected her to send money back to Guatemala every month, even when it meant she couldn't afford to fix her car or buy her children proper winter coats. Love doesn't mean sacrificing yourself completely, she said one evening as we cleaned our brushes. Love means caring about someone while also caring about yourself. If you're always giving and they're always taking, that's not love. That's exploitation. Exploitation. Another new word that fit my situation so perfectly it took my breath away. I'd been exploited financially, emotionally, and practically for years, and I'd called it love because I didn't know the difference. I'd thought that being a good mother meant being infinitely available and endlessly generous, even when that generosity impoverished me and that availability exhausted me. But good mothers raised children who became caring, responsible adults. Good mothers created relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. If my son was treating me with such casual disregard, then either I'd failed as a mother or he'd failed as a human being. Given the evidence of his capacity for kindness toward others and his success in other areas of his life, I was starting to think the problem wasn't my parenting. The problem was that I'd continued to treat him like a child who needed constant support and forgiveness, even after he'd become an adult who was perfectly capable of treating me with dignity and respect if he chose to do so. It was January when I finally decided to respond to one of his voicemails, but not in the way he expected. Instead of calling him back, I wrote him a letter. An actual letter, written by hand on good paper, the kind of communication that required thought and intention. I spent several days working on it, writing draft after draft until I found the words that expressed what I needed to say without being cruel or manipulative. I wanted to be clear and honest about how his behavior had affected me, but I also wanted to leave room for him to respond thoughtfully rather than defensively. The final version was 2 pages long. I told him about standing on his porch on Christmas Eve and how it felt to see that sign. I told him about the years of financial support that had never been acknowledged or repaid, about the phone calls that only came when he needed something, about the loneliness of holidays spent alone while he celebrated with others. But I also told him about the art class and the new friends I was making. I told him about the volunteer work I was considering and the trip I was planning to visit my sister. I told him that I was learning to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for his attention or approval. I love you, I wrote at the end. I will always love you. But I can't continue to accept being treated as if my feelings and needs don't matter. If you want to rebuild our relationship, I'm open to that conversation. But it will need to be a relationship between two adults who respect each other, not a one-way street where I give everything and you take whatever you need. I mailed the letter on a Tuesday and spent the rest of the week wondering if he would respond at all. Part of me expected him to call immediately, either angry about my accusations or full of apologies and promises to do better. But the phone remained silent, and no return letter appeared in my mailbox. Instead, something else happened. Sandra called. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name on my caller ID, but curiosity won out over caution. "Margaret," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, surprised by how calm I sounded. "Michael is very upset about your letter. He says you're being unfair and hurtful, bringing up old grievances that he thought were resolved." "What grievances are those?" I asked. There was a pause. "You know, the money stuff. He says he thought you understood that family helps family, and now you're making it sound like some kind of business transaction. Family helps family." I thought about all the ways I'd helped Michael over the years, and all the ways that help had never been reciprocated when I needed support. "Sandra," I said carefully, "when I was in the hospital last spring, did Michael tell you about it?" Another pause, longer this time. "He mentioned you'd had some kind of health scare." "Some kind of health scare? Is that how he described it?" "Well, I mean, you were fine, right? It wasn't serious." "I collapsed in a grocery store and was rushed to the emergency room. I spent the night alone in a hospital bed while doctors ran tests to determine whether I'd had a heart attack. I was terrified and alone, and when I called my son for support, he was at a barbecue and couldn't be bothered to leave early or even call back to check on me." The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. "I didn't know it was that serious," she said finally. "Because he didn't tell you it was serious. Just like he probably didn't tell you that I've lent you thousands of dollars over the years that have never been repaid. Just like he probably didn't mention that I haven't been invited to a family gathering in over 2 years. Margaret, you're making this sound worse than it is. We've included you, when?" I interrupted. "When have you included me?" "Not at Christmas. Not at Easter. Not at the children's birthday parties. Not at your anniversary dinner last year. When exactly have I been included?" I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, but she didn't answer. "I'm not angry," I continued, which was true. The fury I'd felt in December had settled into something steadier and more purposeful. "I'm just done pretending that the way I've been treated is acceptable. If Michael wants to repair our relationship, I'm open to that. But it's going to require acknowledging what's actually happened and making real changes, not just promising to do better while continuing the same patterns." "He's a good man," Sandra said, her voice defensive now. "I know he is. I raised him. But good people can still behave badly, especially when they're allowed to get away with it repeatedly. I allowed it because I thought that's what love looked like. I was wrong." She tried to argue with me for a few more minutes, alternating between guilt trips about how much Michael was hurting and practical explanations for why their family life was too complicated to include me more often. I listened politely but didn't engage with the emotional manipulation or accept the excuses. When she finally hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Not the hollow satisfaction of winning an argument, but the deeper relief that comes from finally telling the truth about a situation you've been pretending was something other than what it was. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to look at my painting from the previous week's class. It was a landscape, or at least my attempt at one, with a winding path that disappeared around a bend between 2 hills. Elena had suggested we paint paths as a way of thinking about transitions and new beginnings. Looking at it now, I realized I was standing at the beginning of that path, facing a bend I couldn't see around. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side, but I knew I was finally ready to start walking. Michael did eventually call, about a week after Sandra's conversation with me. His voice was subdued when I answered, none of the casual cheerfulness that had characterized his previous messages. "Mom," he said. "I got your letter. I figured you had. I think you're being unfair. I think you're remembering things differently than they actually happened." It was such a classic response that I almost laughed. When someone calls you out on bad behavior, tell them they're remembering wrong or being too sensitive or taking things the wrong way. "What part am I remembering incorrectly?" I asked. "Well, like the money stuff. You act like I forced you to help us financially, but you offered. You wanted to help. I thought that made you happy." "Helping you did make me happy," I said. "What didn't make me happy was having my help taken for granted and never reciprocated. What didn't make me happy was being treated like an ATM instead of a person. That's not fair, Mom. We're not rich. We have our own expenses and responsibilities. I understand that. What I don't understand is why your expenses and responsibilities always took precedence over treating me with basic respect and consideration." He tried to argue, to explain why each incident I'd mentioned in my letter wasn't as bad as I was making it sound. The Christmas Eve situation was a miscommunication. The hospital thing was an oversight. The money was always intended to be paid back eventually. I let him talk, but I didn't try to convince him he was wrong. People have to be ready to see their own behavior clearly, and Michael clearly wasn't ready yet. Maybe he never would be. That was his choice to make. "I understand you see things differently," I said when he finished his explanations. "But my feelings about how I've been treated are valid regardless of your intentions. If you want to rebuild our relationship, we need to find a way forward that works for both of us. If you don't want to do that work, that's also your choice. What does that mean, exactly? It means I'm not going to keep accepting crumbs and pretending they're a feast. It means if you want me in your life, you need to make space for me in your life. Real space, not just emergency phone calls when you need something. And if I don't? The question hung in the air between us. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the moment when I had to choose between holding my boundaries and risking the complete loss of my relationship with my son. Then we'll both know where we stand, I said. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. I'd done it. I'd finally said out loud what I'd been thinking for months, that I was prepared to lose this relationship rather than continue accepting the unacceptable terms that had been offered to me. It should have felt more dramatic. In my imagination, this moment had always been accompanied by tears or anger or some kind of emotional fireworks. Instead, it just felt quiet and clear, like taking off a pair of shoes that had been pinching for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without pain. The weeks that followed were strange and peaceful. My phone didn't ring with crisis calls or requests for money. I didn't spend my evenings wondering whether I should reach out to Michael or waiting for him to reach out to me. For the first time in years, I had no relationship maintenance to do, no emotional labor to perform, no one else's problems to solve. It was unsettling at first. I'd grown so accustomed to being needed, even in destructive ways, that I didn't quite know what to do with myself when no one was asking anything of me. But gradually, I began to remember what it felt like to have time and energy for my own interests and concerns. My art was improving. Elena had introduced us to watercolors, and I discovered I had an intuitive understanding of how the pigments moved and blended on wet paper. My paintings were becoming less dark and more complex, with layers of color that created unexpected depths and moods. I'd also started volunteering at a community organization that provided meals and companionship for homebound seniors. 3 mornings a week, I'd drive to various apartments and small houses around the city, delivering fresh meals and spending a few minutes chatting with people who were largely isolated due to health problems, mobility issues, or simply the natural shrinkage of social circles that comes with age. It was deeply satisfying work. These were people who genuinely appreciated my presence, who looked forward to my visits and remembered details about my life from week to week. Mrs. Kowalski always asked about my painting classes and wanted to see photos of my latest work. Mr. Rodriguez saved up jokes to tell me and took genuine delight in making me laugh. Ms. Washington had started teaching me to knit during my visits, patiently correcting my mistakes and encouraging my progress. These relationships were simple and reciprocal in ways that my relationship with Michael had never been. I brought them food and conversation, and they brought me gratitude and genuine interest in my well-being. No one was using anyone else, we were just people being kind to each other because kindness made all of our lives better. I was also planning my trip to visit my sister in New York, the first vacation I'd taken in decades that wasn't centered around family obligations or someone else's agenda. Emma had been thrilled when I called to propose the visit, and we'd spent hours on the phone planning activities and reminiscing about our childhood. "I'm so proud of you," she'd said during one of our conversations. "I've been worried about you for years, watching you exhaust yourself trying to make Michael happy. You deserve so much better than what he's given you." It was validating to hear someone else acknowledge what I'd been experiencing. Emma had witnessed some of the family dynamics during her occasional visits to Chicago, and she'd bitten her tongue about Michael's treatment of me more than once. "Why didn't you say anything before?" I asked her. "Because you weren't ready to hear it. When someone is still hoping a situation will improve, criticism of the other person just makes them defensive. I could see you were suffering, but I also knew you had to come to your own conclusions about what to do about it." Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in decades. I'd planted flowers in the small window boxes outside my apartment, bright marigolds and petunias that added color to the gray facade of the building. My neighbors commented on them when I passed in the hallway, and Mrs. Torres had started bringing me clippings from her own garden to expand my small urban oasis. It was during this period of growth and renewal that Michael called again. I almost didn't recognize his voice at first, it was softer than usual, less certain. "Mom," he said. "I've been thinking about our last conversation." I waited for him to continue. "I think maybe I haven't been as good a son as I thought I was." It was the first acknowledgement I'd ever heard from him that his behavior toward me might have been problematic. I felt a flutter of hope, immediately followed by caution. Words were easy, change was hard. "What makes you say that?" I asked. "Sandra and I have been talking about it. About how we treat people, how we prioritize things. And some of our friends have made comments. I guess I never realized how it looked from the outside. I wondered what those friends had said, what it had taken for him to see our relationship through different eyes. But I also reminded myself that external pressure might motivate temporary change without creating lasting transformation. I'm glad you're thinking about it, I said carefully. I want to do better. I want to be better. But I don't know how to fix this, Mom. I don't know where to start. This was the conversation I'd been hoping for, dreading, and preparing for all at once. The moment when I had to decide whether to believe that real change was possible or whether this was just another manipulation designed to restore the status quo. What would doing better look like to you? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. I guess it would mean treating you like family instead of treating you like someone who's just there when I need her. It would mean asking how you're doing and actually listening to the answer. It would mean including you in things instead of making excuses for why you can't come. It was a good start, but it was still abstract. Good intentions without concrete actions were just another form of empty promise. Those things sound nice, I said. But I need to see changes, not just hear about them. I need to experience being treated differently, not just be told that you want to treat me differently. I understand. What would that look like from your perspective? For the first time in our conversation, I heard something in his voice that I hadn't heard in years, genuine curiosity about my experience and my needs. Not defensive justification or dismissive minimization, but actual interest in understanding my point of view. It would mean regular contact that isn't crisis-driven, I said. Phone calls or visits that are about maintaining our relationship, not just about you needing something from me. It would mean being included in family plans and celebrations, not as an afterthought but as someone whose presence is actually desired. What about the money stuff? I'd been dreading this part of the conversation, but I was also prepared for it. It would mean acknowledging the financial help I've given over the years and making some effort to repay at least part of it, even if it's just small amounts over time. But more importantly, it would mean not asking for money anymore unless it's a genuine emergency, and even then, asking rather than assuming I'll say yes. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, processing what I'd said. You're right, he said finally. I have taken advantage of your generosity. I told myself it was okay because you're my mother and you wanted to help, but that was selfish. You've given me thousands of dollars over the years, and I've never even thanked you properly, let alone tried to pay any of it back. Thousands of dollars. It was the first time either of us had put a number on it, and hearing him acknowledge the scope of what I'd given was both validating and painful. It wasn't just about the money, I said. It was about feeling like my value to you was primarily financial. Like I was someone you kept around because I was useful, not because you actually enjoyed my company or cared about my well-being. That's not how I see you, Mom. But I understand how my behavior might have made you feel that way. We talked for another hour, the longest conversation we'd had in years that wasn't focused on some crisis or immediate need. He asked about my art classes and my volunteer work, and he seemed genuinely interested in my answers. He told me about the kids' school activities and Sandra's new job, sharing information about their lives rather than requesting solutions to their problems. When we finally hung up, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. This felt different from his previous apologies and promises. More thoughtful, more specific, more grounded in actual understanding of what had gone wrong. But I also reminded myself that one good conversation didn't undo years of problematic behavior. Real change would require sustained effort over time, and I needed to protect myself from getting drawn back into old patterns too quickly. Over the following weeks, Michael did follow through on some of his commitments. He called twice a week, and the conversations were genuinely two-way exchanges rather than monologues about his problems. He sent me photos of the grandchildren and updates about their activities without being prompted. He even mentioned wanting to plan a family dinner where I would be the guest of honor rather than the emergency childcare provider. But it was the financial gesture that surprised me most. A check arrived in my mailbox with a handwritten note. This is the first installment toward paying back the money you've lent us over the years. It's not nearly enough, and it's long overdue, but it's a start. Thank you for everything you've done for our family, and I'm sorry it took me so long to acknowledge it properly. The check was for $500, not a huge amount in the context of what I'd given them, but significant enough to represent genuine sacrifice on their part rather than just token gesture. More importantly, it represented acknowledgement of the debt and commitment to addressing it over time. I deposited the check, but I also kept the note. It was the first written thank you I'd ever received from Michael for any of the financial help I'd provided, and the first acknowledgement that repayment was both possible and appropriate. Things seemed to be improving, slowly but genuinely. I allowed myself to hope that we might actually be able to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. The boundaries I'd established were holding, and Michael appeared to be respecting them rather than testing them. But families are complicated systems, and changing one relationship often affects others in unexpected ways. I discovered this in late April when Sandra called me, her voice tight with controlled anger. Margaret, I need you to stop poisoning Michael against his own family. I was so startled by the accusation that I almost dropped the phone. I beg your pardon? Ever since your little ultimatum, Michael has been different. He questions everything now, analyzes every interaction, makes comments about whether we're treating people fairly. It's exhausting, and it's affecting our marriage. I felt a surge of defensive anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. Sandra, I haven't said anything to Michael about your marriage or your family dynamics. I've only talked to him about my relationship with him. But you've made him paranoid about motives and fairness and all this psychological stuff that's making him impossible to live with. If Michael is questioning whether people in his life are treating each other fairly, that sounds like personal growth, not poisoning. Personal growth? Her voice rose to a near shriek. He started asking me to justify every decision I make, every plan I propose. He wants to know if we're including the right people and considering everyone's feelings. It's like living with a therapist. I almost smiled despite the tension of the conversation. If Michael was applying the same scrutiny to his other relationships that he'd been forced to apply to his relationship with me, it suggested that he was actually learning something meaningful about empathy and consideration. I'm sorry you're finding it difficult, I said diplomatically. But I can't control how Michael chooses to process the conversations we've had or how he applies what he's learned to other areas of his life. You could fix this by going back to the way things were. You could stop being so demanding and difficult and just accept that families aren't perfect. Demanding and difficult. There it was again, the suggestion that my desire to be treated with basic respect was some kind of unreasonable imposition on everyone else's convenience. The way things were wasn't working for me, Sandra. I spent years accepting that families aren't perfect while being the person who absorbed all the imperfection without any consideration for my own needs or feelings. But you're his mother. That's what mothers do. No, I said firmly. That's what martyrs do. Mothers raise children who grow into adults capable of healthy, reciprocal relationships. If I failed to do that, then it's not too late for Michael to learn those skills now. The conversation devolved from there, with Sandra alternating between guilt trips about how my selfishness was affecting the grandchildren and threats about limiting my access to the family if I didn't return to my previous accommodating behavior. I listened to it all with a sense of detachment that surprised me. A year ago, these threats would have terrified me into immediate capitulation. The possibility of losing access to my grandchildren would have been enough to make me abandon any attempt at self-advocacy. But I'd learned something important during my months of enforced distance from the family. Threats are only effective if you're not prepared to lose what's being threatened. I'd already lost meaningful access to my grandchildren years ago. I'd already been excluded from family gatherings and celebrations. I'd already been treated as a peripheral figure whose presence was optional at best. Sandra wasn't threatening to take something away from me, she was threatening to make official what had already been the practical reality of my situation. And I was no longer afraid of that reality because I'd started building a life that didn't depend on their approval or inclusion. When she finally ran out of arguments and threats, I said simply, I understand you're upset. But I'm not going back to accepting unacceptable treatment. If Michael is becoming more considerate of other people's feelings as a result of our conversations, that seems like a positive development to me. The line went quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. You've changed, she said finally, her voice cold. Yes, I agreed. I have. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking out at my window boxes, now full of thriving flowers that brightened the whole room. I had changed. The woman who would have crumbled under Sandra's emotional manipulation and immediately called Michael to apologize for causing problems was gone. In her place was someone who could listen to threats and criticism with calm detachment, secure in the knowledge that she deserved better treatment regardless of other people's comfort with providing it. It was both liberating and lonely, this new version of myself. Liberating because I no longer felt compelled to twist myself into whatever shape others found most convenient. Lonely because it had cost me relationships with people who were only willing to maintain connection on terms that were unhealthy for me. But the loneliness was different from the isolation I'd experienced during the years of being taken for granted. That had been the loneliness of being surrounded by people who didn't really see or value me. This was the loneliness of integrity, of choosing authenticity over acceptance. It was sad, but it wasn't hollow. Michael called the next day, his voice apologetic and concerned. Mom, Sandra told me about your conversation yesterday. I'm sorry she said those things to you. Which things in particular are you apologizing for? All of it, honestly. The accusations about poisoning me against my family, the demands that you go back to accepting whatever treatment we dished out, the threats about limiting your access to the kids. None of that was okay. I was surprised by how clearly he could see the problem with Sandra's approach, and how willing he was to criticize his wife's behavior in defense of mine. What did you tell her? I told her that you didn't poison me against anyone. You just helped me see that I'd been taking you for granted for years, and that once I started paying attention to how I was treating you, it became obvious that I needed to pay attention to how I treat everyone. I told her that's not poisoning, that's just basic human decency. How did she react to that? He sighed. Not well. She thinks I'm being manipulated by you and that I was fine before you started making demands about being treated better. And what do you think? I think I wasn't fine before. I think I was just oblivious to the ways my behavior was hurting people who cared about me. That might have been more comfortable for me, but it wasn't morally acceptable. It was such a mature, thoughtful response that I felt tears welling up in my eyes. This was the son I'd raised, the one who could acknowledge his mistakes and commit to doing better. He'd been buried under years of entitlement and self-centeredness, but he was still there. I'm proud of you for being willing to look at these things honestly, I told him. I should have done it years ago. I wasted so much time being defensive instead of just listening to what you were trying to tell me. We talked for another hour about the difficulties of changing established family dynamics and the resistance that often comes when one person starts insisting on healthier boundaries. He was struggling with Sandra's anger about his newfound awareness, but he seemed committed to not reverting to his old patterns of thoughtlessness. I want to have that family dinner I mentioned, he said as our conversation wound down. Not as a way to prove anything or make up for anything specific, but just because I want to spend time with you and have the kids get to know their grandmother better. I'd like that, I said, and I realized I actually meant it. For the first time in years, the prospect of spending time with my son's family felt appealing rather than fraught. We scheduled the dinner for the following Sunday, and I spent the week feeling cautiously excited about it. I bought a new dress, not because I felt obligated to impress anyone, but because I wanted to mark the occasion as something special. I made my famous apple pie, the one Michael had loved as a child, not because I felt pressured to contribute more than my presence, but because I enjoyed baking and wanted to share something I was good at. The dinner itself was revelatory. Michael picked me up personally rather than expecting me to find my own transportation. Sandra was polite, if somewhat cool, but she didn't make any snide comments or passive-aggressive remarks. The children, initially shy after our long estrangement, gradually warmed up and began chattering about school and friends and their various interests. But what struck me most was how Michael behaved toward me throughout the evening. He asked for my opinions on various topics and listened to my responses with apparent interest. He made sure I was included in conversations rather than letting them flow around me. He asked about my art and my volunteer work, and when I showed him pictures of my latest paintings on my phone, he seemed genuinely impressed rather than patronizing. It was a glimpse of what our relationship could be like if we continued on this path of mutual respect and consideration. Not perfect, because no relationship is perfect, but balanced and reciprocal in ways it had never been before. The evening wasn't without its awkward moments. There were topics we carefully avoided, old wounds that hadn't fully healed, dynamics that were still in transition. But there was also warmth and genuine affection, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was spending time with people who actually wanted me there. When Michael drove me home at the end of the evening, he walked me to my door rather than just dropping me off at the curb. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said. "And thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave you plenty of reasons to." I almost did give up, I admitted. There were moments when it would have been easier to just write you off and focus on building relationships with people who already knew how to treat me well. What stopped you? I thought about it for a moment. Hope, I guess. And stubbornness. I knew the son I'd raised was still in there somewhere, buried under all the selfishness and entitlement. I wasn't sure I'd be able to dig him out, but I wasn't ready to stop trying entirely. He hugged me then, a real hug that lasted longer than the perfunctory embraces we'd exchanged for years. When he pulling away, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Mom. I'm going to keep doing better." "I love you too," I said. "And I believe you will." After he left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, reflecting on how different this evening had felt from all the family gatherings I'd fantasized about during my lonely months of exclusion. It had been better than my fantasies because it had been real, not some idealized version of family harmony, but actual people making actual efforts to treat each other with care and respect. It had also been different from my old family experiences because my role had been different. Instead of being the person who facilitated everyone else's good time while sacrificing my own needs, I'd been a genuine participant whose presence was valued rather than simply utilized. The change wasn't just in how Michael treated me, it was in how I saw myself within the family dynamic. I was no longer the infinitely giving mother who absorbed whatever treatment was offered without complaint. I was a person with my own interests, opinions, and boundaries, someone whose well-being mattered as much as anyone else's. This transformation had come at a cost. There had been months of loneliness, moments of doubt about whether I was being too demanding or unrealistic in my expectations. There had been the risk of losing my relationship with my son entirely, and the reality of losing the version of that relationship I'd clung to for so many years. But what I'd gained was immeasurably more valuable than what I'd lost. I'd gained self-respect and authentic connection. I'd gained relationships with new friends who appreciated me as I was rather than trying to reshape me into what was convenient for them. I'd gained creative outlets and volunteer commitments that gave my life meaning beyond my role as a mother and grandmother. Most importantly, I'd gained the knowledge that I could survive and thrive without accepting unacceptable treatment from anyone, even people I loved deeply. That knowledge was like a superpower I'd been carrying around for decades without realizing I had it. The relationship with Michael continued to improve slowly over the following months. There were setbacks and awkward moments as we both learned to navigate new patterns of interaction. Sandra remained somewhat distant, clearly still resentful of the changes in her husband that she attributed to my influence. The grandchildren were cautious but increasingly warm as they got used to having me around more regularly. Not everything was perfect, and I no longer expected or needed it to be. Perfect families exist only in greeting cards and television commercials. Real families are complicated, messy, imperfect systems of people who love each other despite their flaws and limitations. But real families are also supposed to be safe spaces where every member's dignity is protected and everyone's well-being matters. They're supposed to be characterized by reciprocity and consideration, not exploitation and neglect. Michael and I were learning to create that kind of family, one conversation and one shared experience at a time. My sister Emma visited in June, and she was amazed by the changes she saw in both my living situation and my demeanor. "You look younger," she said as we sat in my sunny kitchen, surrounded by plants and artwork that reflected my new interests and priorities. "More alive. More like yourself." "I feel more like myself," I agreed. I'd forgotten what that felt like. "And Michael? How are things going with him?" I told her about the family dinner, about the regular phone calls that weren't crisis-driven, about the financial payments he'd been making toward his old debt, small but consistent amounts that demonstrated ongoing commitment rather than one-time gesture. "I'm proud of both of you," she said. "It takes courage to demand better treatment, but it also takes courage to admit you need to change how you treat someone and then actually do the work to change." We spent the day walking around the neighborhood where I'd now lived for several years but was only now really experiencing as a community rather than just a place to exist between family obligations. Emma was charmed by the vibrant murals on the sides of buildings, the small businesses owned by families who'd been in the area for generations, the community gardens where neighbors shared tools and expertise and produce. "This is a real neighborhood," she observed. "The kind where people know each other and look out for each other." "I'm finally letting myself be part of it," I said. For years I was so focused on what was happening with Michael's family that I barely noticed the community that was right outside my door. That evening, as we prepared dinner together in my small kitchen, Emma brought up something that had been on my mind as well. "What do you think would have happened if Michael hadn't been willing to change? If he'd just continued treating you the same way?" I'd asked myself this question many times during the uncertain months when I wasn't sure whether my boundaries would result in reconciliation or permanent estrangement. "I would have been sad," I said honestly. "I would have grieved the loss of the relationship I'd always hoped we could have. But I wouldn't have been destroyed by it, because I'd already started building a life that didn't depend on his approval or participation." "And that would have been enough?" "It would have had to be enough. And yes, I think it would have been. Not ideal, not what I would have chosen, but enough." The thought didn't frighten me anymore. I'd learned that it was possible to love someone deeply while also accepting that you might not be able to have a healthy relationship with them. I'd learned that you could grieve the loss of what you'd hoped for while also celebrating what you'd actually found. Most importantly, I'd learned that your worth as a person isn't determined by how other people choose to treat you, even if those people are your own children. You can't control other people's behavior, but you can control your response to it, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved is to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. As summer progressed, I found myself thinking less and less about the painful years that had led up to my transformation and more about the possibilities that lay ahead. I was planning another visit to see Emma in the fall, this time including some sightseeing in New England during the peak foliage season. I was considering taking a more advanced art class and maybe even entering some of my work in a local exhibition. I was exploring volunteer opportunities with organizations that served isolated seniors, building on the experience I'd gained and the satisfaction I'd found in that work. Michael had started inviting me to more family activities, and I'd started accepting the invitations that genuinely appealed to me while politely declining others. I no longer felt obligated to say yes to every opportunity to spend time with them, which paradoxically made the time we did spend together more enjoyable for everyone. I was also becoming more selective about the kinds of help I offered and the conditions under which I offered it. When Michael mentioned that they were struggling to afford summer camp for the kids, I suggested several free and low-cost alternatives rather than immediately offering to pay the fees. When Sandra complained about the cost of her mother's upcoming visit, I listened sympathetically without volunteering to subsidize their hospitality. These might seem like small changes, but they represented a fundamental shift in how I saw my role in their lives. I was no longer the family ATM, available to solve any financial problem without question or acknowledgement. I was a grandmother who cared about her grandchildren's experiences and wanted to help when possible, but who also had limits and expected appreciation for whatever assistance I provided. The transformation wasn't just about money, of course. It was about recognizing that love doesn't require self-sacrifice to the point of self-destruction. It was about understanding that healthy relationships involve give and take, consideration and reciprocity, respect and appreciation. I was still learning these lessons, still practicing new behaviors and responses. After decades of people-pleasing and boundary-less giving, it took conscious effort to ask myself what I wanted and needed in various situations rather than automatically focusing on what others wanted and needed from me. But the effort was paying off in ways I couldn't have imagined when I first started this journey. My relationships were more honest and balanced. My days were more intentional and fulfilling. My sense of myself was more stable and secure. And perhaps most surprisingly, my relationship with Michael was becoming more authentic and enjoyable than it had been since he was a child. Without the undercurrent of resentment and exploitation that had characterized our interactions for so many years, we were discovering that we actually liked each other as people, not just as mother and son fulfilling inherited roles. It was September when the Real test came, the moment that showed me how much had actually changed and how far we'd both come. Michael called on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear the stress in his voice immediately. "Mom," he said, "I hate to ask, but we're in a really tough spot financially. Sandra's been out of work for 6 weeks with that back injury, and we're behind on everything. The mortgage, the car payment, the credit cards. I know I promised not to ask you for money anymore except in emergencies, but this really is an emergency." A year ago, this call would have triggered immediate panic in me. Not panic about their financial situation, but panic about disappointing my son by potentially saying no to his request. I would have mentally calculated how much money I had available, figured out how to make the loan work even if it meant sacrificing something important for my own well-being, and transferred the money before we hung up the phone. But this time, I felt calm and clear. "That sounds very stressful," I said. "What kind of help are you looking for?" "We need about $3,000 to catch up on the most important bills and buy us some time to figure out a longer-term solution. I know it's a lot, and I know I still owe you money from before, but I promise we'll pay this back as soon as Sandra's disability payments start coming through." $3,000. It was more than I had in my checking account, and accessing it would require withdrawing money from the small emergency fund I'd been carefully rebuilding after years of family loans had depleted my savings. "Michael," I said gently, "I don't have that kind of money available to lend right now." There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could feel him processing what I'd said. "I understand that my financial situation has improved since I stopped lending money regularly," I continued, "but $3,000 is still a significant amount for me. It would require me to deplete my emergency fund, and I'm not comfortable doing that." "Oh," he said, and I could hear the disappointment in his voice. But there was something else too, something that sounded like understanding rather than anger. "I'm sorry you're in this position," I said. "Have you looked into other options? Personal loans from the bank, borrowing against your 401k, asking Sandra's parents for help? We've tried the bank, but our credit isn't great right now because of some late payments. Sandra doesn't want to ask her parents. The 401k thing might be possible, but there are penalties." We talked for a few more minutes about potential alternatives and resources. I offered to help them research assistance programs for people dealing with temporary disability. I suggested they speak with a financial counselor about debt management strategies. I listened to his concerns and offered emotional support without offering financial rescue. When we hung up, I felt sad for their situation but not guilty about my response. I'd been honest about my limitations, offered appropriate kinds of help, and maintained boundaries that protected my own financial security. It wasn't fun to see people I cared about struggling, but it wasn't my responsibility to solve every problem they encountered. The real test came 2 days later when Michael called back. "Mom, I wanted to thank you for our conversation on Tuesday night." That wasn't what I'd expected him to say. "You're welcome, but I'm not sure what you're thanking me for. I didn't give you the money you needed." "No, but you didn't just say no and hang up either. You listened to what was happening, you offered suggestions for other approaches, and you were honest about your own limitations instead of making up excuses. It felt like you cared about our situation even though you couldn't solve it for us." I was quiet, absorbing what he was telling me. "And it made me realize something," he continued. "For years, I've been treating you like a bank instead of like a person. I'd call with financial emergencies and expect you to fix them, and when you did fix them, I'd feel relieved but also kind of resentful, like you were enabling me to avoid dealing with my own problems." "Resentful?" "Yeah. It's twisted, But part of me would get annoyed that you'd bail us out so easily, because it made me feel like a child who couldn't handle his own life. But I kept asking anyway because it was easier than facing the consequences of our financial mismanagement. This was the most psychologically sophisticated conversation I'd ever had with my son, and it was happening because I'd finally learned to say no with kindness rather than saying yes with resentment. What happened with the $3,000? I asked. We ended up talking to Sandra's parents after all, and they agreed to help with some of it. We also worked out payment plans with a couple of our creditors and applied for a temporary hardship deferment on the mortgage. It's not ideal, but it's manageable, and we're dealing with it ourselves instead of just passing the problem to someone else. How does that feel? Weird, honestly. Scary but also kind of empowering. Like we're actually adults who can handle difficult situations instead of just grown-up children who run to mommy whenever things get tough. After that conversation, I sat in my living room looking at the painting I'd been working on in my Tuesday evening art class. It was a self-portrait, something Elena had suggested as a way of exploring how we saw ourselves after months of creative work and personal growth. The woman in the painting looked like me but also different from how I'd seen myself for years. Her expression was calm and direct, neither apologetic nor defensive. Her posture was upright and relaxed, suggesting both strength and ease. Her eyes were clear, focused on something beyond the viewer, as if she had places to go and things to do that didn't require anyone else's permission or approval. It struck me that this might be what Emma had meant when she said I looked more like myself. I was finally becoming the person I'd been before years of destructive relationship patterns had worn away my sense of my own worth and agency. The holidays that year were different from any I'd experienced in decades. For the first time, I was invited to participate in planning Christmas dinner rather than just being expected to show up and help with whatever tasks needed doing. Michael and Sandra asked what dishes I'd like to contribute and made sure to accommodate my dietary preferences when planning the menu. More importantly, they asked what I wanted to do rather than just telling me what was happening and assuming I'd fit in with their plans. When I mentioned that I'd been hoping to attend the Christmas Eve service at the local church where I'd started volunteering, they adjusted their schedule so I could do that and still join them for dinner the following day. The grandchildren, now more accustomed to my presence and attention, had made cards and artwork specifically for me rather than including me as an afterthought in their generic family gifts. They asked about my painting classes and my volunteer work with the genuine curiosity of children who'd been taught that adults have interesting lives beyond their family roles. But the moment that brought tears to my eyes came when Michael stood up before we ate Christmas dinner and asked everyone to pause for a moment of gratitude. "I want to thank everyone who's here today," he said, looking around the table at Sandra, the children, Sandra's parents who were visiting, and me. "But I especially want to thank my mom, who taught me an important lesson this year about the difference between love and enabling, and who never stopped believing that I could become the kind of person worth having a relationship with." It wasn't a flowery or elaborate speech, but it was sincere and specific, and it acknowledged something that felt true about our journey together. I hadn't just given up on him when his behavior became unacceptable, but I also hadn't continued to enable that behavior by pretending it was okay. The path between those two extremes had been difficult to find and sometimes uncomfortable to walk, but it had led us to this moment, a Christmas dinner where I felt genuinely valued and included, not because I'd earned my place through financial contribution or endless accommodation, but because I was someone people actually wanted to spend time with. As winter turned to spring and I approached my 74th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gift that had come from what had initially felt like the worst period of my adult life. The loneliness and rejection I'd experienced during those months of estrangement from Michael had forced me to discover that I could create meaning and happiness independently of his approval or participation. That discovery had been liberating in ways that extended far beyond our relationship. I'd stopped waiting for other people to decide whether I was worthy of invitation, attention, or consideration, and I'd started creating opportunities for connection and fulfillment on my own terms. My volunteer work had expanded to include serving on the board of the organization that provided meals to homebound seniors. My artistic skills had developed to the point where I was teaching basic painting techniques to other older adults in my neighborhood. I'd traveled to visit Emma twice and had started planning a trip to see some of the national parks I'd always dreamed of visiting. Most importantly, I'd learned to see myself as the protagonist of my own life rather than as a supporting character in everyone else's story. My needs, interests, and boundaries mattered just as much as anyone else's, and I no longer needed permission from family members to pursue the things that brought me joy and satisfaction. The relationship with Michael had been rebuilt on this foundation of mutual respect and consideration, but it was no longer the central organizing principle of my existence. It was one important relationship among several, one source of meaning and connection among many. That felt amazingly healthy and sustainable in ways that my previous family-centric approach to life never had. I no longer lived in fear of disappointing my son or losing his approval, because my sense of self-worth no longer depended on his opinion of me. I could love him fully while also maintaining the boundaries necessary to protect my own well-being. As I write this story now, 2 years after that terrible Christmas Eve when I stood outside Michael's house reading a sign that defined me as not family, I want to share what I've learned with anyone who might be struggling with similar dynamics in their own relationships. You cannot love someone into treating you well. You cannot sacrifice yourself enough to earn respect from someone who doesn't value you. You cannot give your way into a healthy relationship with someone who sees your generosity as weakness rather than gift. But you can love someone and refuse to accept unacceptable treatment from them. You can set boundaries that protect your dignity while leaving room for reconciliation if the other person chooses to change. You can grieve the loss of the relationship you hoped for while also celebrating the life you're actually building. Most importantly, you can discover that you are enough, all by yourself, to create a meaningful and joyful existence. Other people's love and appreciation are wonderful additions to that life, but they're not prerequisites for your happiness or your worth as a human being. The morning after I finished my volunteer shift at the senior meal program, Mrs. Kowalski grabbed my hand as I was preparing to leave. "You saved my life," she said, her eyes bright with tears. "Not just with the meals, but with being someone who sees me as a whole person instead of just an old lady who needs help." I squeezed her hand and smiled. "You've saved mine too, in ways you probably don't realize." And it was true. All of these relationships I'd built outside of my family had saved me from the despair and worthlessness I'd felt during those years of being taken for granted. They'd shown me that I had value and talents and wisdom that were appreciated when offered to the right people in the right circumstances. The lesson I want to leave you with is this: if you're in a relationship where you're constantly giving but rarely receiving appreciation, consideration, or reciprocation, you're not in a loving relationship. You're in an exploitative one, and the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to stop enabling it to continue. That doesn't necessarily mean ending the relationship, but it does mean changing the terms of engagement. It means setting boundaries that protect your well-being and insisting that those boundaries be respected. It means offering what you can freely give without resentment while refusing to sacrifice what you need for your own health and happiness. Sometimes, as in my case, this approach leads to growth and healing and renewed connection. Sometimes it leads to the end of relationships that were never healthy to begin with. Either outcome is better than continuing to participate in dynamics that diminish your worth and exhaust your spirit. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect by everyone in your life, including your family members. You deserve to have your needs and feelings considered in the decisions that affect you. You deserve reciprocity in your relationships and appreciation for your contributions. If you're not receiving these things, it's not because you don't deserve them. It's because the people you're dealing with have learned that they can get what they want from you without providing what you need in return. The good news is that you have the power to change that dynamic, even if you can't control whether other people choose to participate in the healthier relationship you're offering. The first step is recognizing that your worth isn't determined by how much other people are willing to take from you. The second step is deciding what you're willing to give and under what circumstances. The third step is communicating those boundaries clearly and maintaining them consistently, regardless of other people's reactions. It's not easy work, and it's not quick work. It took me decades to learn these lessons and months to implement them effectively. But every day of that difficult process was worth it for the peace and self-respect I've found on the other side. Have you ever lived through something like this, or known someone who has? Have you found yourself giving endlessly to family members who never seem to appreciate your sacrifices or consider your needs? I hope my story helps you see that there's another way to love people, a way that honors both their dignity and your own. If this resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these stories, and who knows? Maybe someone else needs to hear that they're not alone in their struggles, and that change is possible even when it feels impossible. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for seeing me as more than just someone's mother or grandmother. Thank you for reminding me that everyone's story matters, including mine.